Well, hello, everybody. We can go ahead and call the meeting to order. And clerk, will you call the roll?
Agent,
Here.
Clegg,
Here.
Halliburton,
Here.
Sanchez, Thompson, Woodings, 4 present, 2 absent.
Well, thanks. We've got one item today before executive session, and that is with Nikki Hellenkamp to discuss a short-term rental ordinance. And while Nikki's coming up, I just want to kind of set the stage. For so long, we've heard folks express concerns about short-term rentals. And I know that people are concerned that there's a connection between that and the affordability issues that many of us are experiencing. And so we wanted to look at a step of licensing first, because if in requiring licenses, and Nikki will go through some of what this does, it'll provide us the information that we need to better understand if there are in fact policy changes that need to be made related to short-term rentals. And so, there are easy minimum standards like proof of liability insurance, having a local agent, and somebody that neighbors can get a hold of. And then, of course, accountability around obeying laws. And by having a license, we'll be able to better understand then how many short-term rentals there are in our community, where they are, who owns them, who operates them, what amenities they offer. And frankly, from that information, if we review in a year, we will be able to better make policy decisions around it. So that's the kind of the why behind this ordinance that Nikki will be previewing for everybody today, and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks very much, Madam Mayor, members of council. My name is Nikki Olivier Hellenkamp. As the mayor mentioned, I'm the housing advisor in the mayor's office, and am here with you today to provide information around the ordinance around short-term rentals we've been working on, and to request you to affirm direction. And I don't know how to make my slide show up on the screen. There it is. Okay.
You just go like this.
Yeah. So as the mayor mentioned, the goal here is really to address neighborhood issues caused by short-term vacation rentals, and to better understand specifically the impact of short-term rentals on the larger housing market. So the strategy in order to get there is really focused on gathering the data that we need to even begin to answer these very basic questions around how many units are operating in Boise, who is operating them, where are they located? And then with the goal, as the mayor said, to bring that data back to council for additional consideration, and for you all to decide whether additional policies are needed or appropriate. In terms of a program overview, the ordinance requires that anyone operating a short-term rental obtain and maintain a short-term rental license. This would be an annual license that would be renewed each year. It would require an application fee for each location, and that fee would be set just to cover the cost of administering the program. So that cost is estimated currently at about $80 per location. In terms of the requirements, the operator would provide some very basic information, their name, their address, and contact information. For out-of-state owners, they would provide the same for any local agents, the physical address of the property and a map of the rental, information about which rental marketplaces are being used to list the short-term rental, and proof of insurance. In terms of next steps, should council choose to affirm direction, we would do 3 readings of the ordinance before council. There would be a public hearing on the ordinance at first reading, an estimated 60 days to develop and implement the system at a cost of an estimated $6,300. And the schedule estimates a February 2022 implementation timeline. Although that would be pushed out if there were changes to the ordinance or other reasons for delay. And I think as a particular note around community outreach and education, that this will be an important component. If the council chooses to affirm direction, a big piece of this ordinance will be just around figuring out who these folks are and how we can communicate with them. So the question of how do we do this community outreach when we don't know who we're outreaching to, I think is certainly one that we'll be working on to make sure that that outreach is effective and so that people know what their responsibilities are. And with that, I'll stand for any questions.
Madam Mayor, what's the definition of a short-term rental?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Bajent, I don't have the definition in front of me from the ordinance, and would be happy to get it to you afterwards.
Okay, Madam Mayor, follow up. I guess the part I'm uncertain about, and hopefully you can help me with, is the beginning of the presentation said this is the first step towards addressing problems posed by short-term rentals. And then there's some discussion about gathering information that we need. But why do we need to require people to have insurance, for instance, to gather the information, number one? And why isn't the information that's publicly available, for instance, from Airbnb or other places, already going to get us the bulk of what we need to know in terms of how many and where they are?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Bajent, I think that is, both of those questions are excellent and would be happy to follow up with that information.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor,
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry.
thank you. I appreciate it. Has anyone looked at ways to gather the information in a way that requires a little bit less red tape? So for example, hiring someone to do research or partnering with someone to do research so that we can see what the extent and scope of the issue is before we enact additional regulation.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Woodings, thank you for the question. And I would be happy to follow up with you on this piece as well. And in terms of, I think an important distinction to make here is around regulation versus registration, that this ordinance is really seeking to find information and to do the fact-finding mission, as opposed to providing additional regulations at this point. But it's an excellent question, and I'd be happy to get back to you.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here. This is looking at licensing, just like we license cab drivers, other individual businesses. And the premise behind it is that I think you as council, myself as a former council member, now mayor, have heard often that there's an issue in the community, but we aren't able to really prove or disprove that issue if we don't have the basics covered, which is understanding where they are, if it's 5 owners that have 100 each, or individual, they're all individual owners. And some of that information you just won't get by doing research or by looking at Airbnb listings. And so it's the basics, just like if you live in McCall or other places and you want to do this, you get a license, the city has that information. If there are issues, we're able to then know how to trace the owner or manager, if it's a local agent, of the establishment, and look at whether or not there are trends, and then indeed whether or not we actually need to do something more with regard to regulation. And as I said at the beginning, the answer could well be that we don't need to. We don't know that yet. We want to take the simple step of kind of common sense business practice of licensing.
Madam Mayor,
Mhm.
I appreciate that. I'm not sure I agree. First, a license is a regulation in the sense that you can get in trouble for not doing it, and you're charged to, there's a compliance element and a punishment element. So I think it is a regulation. Second, unlike taxi drivers or all the other things that we license, those situations have a demonstrable harm to the public that then licensure and license requirements are designed to balance and alleviate. This seems different because it sounds like we don't have any information sufficient to show a harm to the public. So what we're going to do instead is charge someone $80 to provide the information that we'd like to know to determine if there's a harm. And that causes me concern.
Madam Mayor. So some questions, I guess, as far as the information that we're gathering, because I think that Council Member Bajent is correct in that you could go on and you could see all the Airbnb listings in Boise, and so you could get a bit of an inventory there. But do we have the ability to say, does one person own 100 of those things, and then another person owns 1, and then another person owns 10, or are we not able to gather that type of information unless we are doing something like this, where we're trying to figure out exactly who owns the properties and those types of things. Do they live in state? Do they live out of state? Because there's all sorts of different regulations all over the country as far as what states or cities want to do as far as allowing short-term rentals. Is that the type of stuff that we're gathering? Is do they live here? Do they not live here? How many do they own? That type of stuff. Is there any other information, I guess, that I'm trying to figure out that we would be gathering through this process?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Halliburton. Yes, I think that's a great question. And there is a lot of information that would be available from Airbnb, from the platforms themselves. But the questions you mentioned around how do we get in touch with one of these owners if there's a problem at one of these sites? How many sites do any one of these owners own? That's not information that we would likely be able to pull off of the platform. And so if that's the kind of information we would like to be able to have, then likely the questions being asked in this ordinance would help us to get there.
Great. Madam Mayor, another question. When we talk about the community outreach and the education, is that just informing the regular community about here's the new regulations that exist as far as these things go? Or is this kind of like contacting all the folks who are on Airbnb to do outreach to let them know of the new policies and the procedures and stuff that are in place? How are we going to be going out and finding all the folks and implementing this new licensing and sort of fee that is associated with it?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Halliburton, I think I would defer to Jamie from the clerk's office on that question. And I think Jamie's joining us by Zoom and might be able to give a little bit more information around that.
Absolutely, Madam Mayor, council members. I think it would be from a community outreach standpoint, multiple approaches. We would take a look at general community outreach. We would probably work with some of the partners with the Airbnb listings that we are aware of, VRBO, Vacasa, all of those different ones that we're aware of, and probably reach out to those companies as well so they also understand what the regulations are in the city of Boise, and then can also have another avenue to communicate to their constituents as well.
And Madam Mayor, just one kind of final question here, and Jamie, you might stay on for this one as well. So if we find that somebody that has been operating after we implement this without a license, is there, I mean, obviously there's like a carrot of like, don't get in trouble before we do this, we're going to do this outreach. Is there a stick that says like you lose your ability to rent this out? Like what are the types of penalties if somebody is not complying with this if we were to move forward?
Yeah, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Halliburton, I think the question here is a good one to define what we can address independent goals and
She's not okay.
sorry. I'm okay.
We're good.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, my apologies for that, but I am happy to stand for any questions and any further feedback you may have on the proposed short-term rental ordinance.
Well, first of all, y'all hope Nikki's going to be okay. So the question I had was, and I think to Council Member Bajan's concern that we don't have any evidence that there's any harm being done. As I understand it, we do have some evidence, especially when there's an emergency call to one of these locations and you're not sure who the owner is and who's in charge and who to talk to. And it seems to me that that alone would be a public interest to be able to understand some of this information that we'll get from the license. Am I correct on that, or am I dreaming?
Madam Mayor, Council President, you are not dreaming. It's been a problem, I know, when the police department responds to one of these locations and it's unclear who the owner is. This is particularly true when teenagers tend to be occupying these types of rentals. The other issue is just in neighborhoods, if you've got, your regular old neighborhood complaints like somebody's tree has fallen over in your yard or what have you, it is difficult to ascertain who that person who's responsible is.
Follow up if I might. And I guess I'd also note that although we can't regulate it through zoning, these are commercial businesses being operated in neighborhoods. And so for those two reasons, I'm comfortable going forward with the license requirements, gathering the data, taking a review period like we often do with these kind of ordinances and saying, okay, what did we learn? Do we need to go forward with this license requirement? Is it too often? Is it too much? Do we need it at all? Is there other? So I guess my guidance would be that we do have a public purpose. We should give it a 1-year time period to see what we know, see what we find out, and take a very strong review at that point and decide what more we need to do or what less we need to do.
Madam Mayor, thank you. Courtney, one thing that I don't know we've discussed related to this, I know we're thinking in terms of the licensing of what happens if there is issues and who do we contact, who can folks get a hold of to deal with these issues. I'm wondering if part of this can, and I don't know how it would work. I don't know how fair housing fits into any of this. If we have, let's say, folks from outside the area who want to make use of one of these short-term rentals and perhaps feel they're discriminated against in being offered one of those vacancies. I'm wondering if we could also look into how that would work with this as well. Because the way we've been talking about it is on the, once you've got somebody in one of these short-term rentals and any issues that might arise, I'm wondering if we could also be available to somebody if they feel that they're not able to access a short-term rental in Boise because of possible discrimination.
Madam Mayor. Courtney, I'm also interested in how other cities have handled it. I mean, because I may have missed it, but it would be interesting to see at least comparable size cities, how they've integrated something around short-term rentals and how it's been, if it's been successful and such. So that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, Council Member, just off the top of my head, and I'll come back with more research. There seems to be a differentiation between someone who resides on a property with one of these who seems to be renting it out to afford the home they're also in on the property, as opposed to the larger commercial enterprises where someone owns multiple short-term rentals, and irregardless of where their own property is in pretty big numbers. So once the data is collected, it looks like cities tend to then treat those segments of the commercial businesses differently. But I'll get back to you on that.
Madam Mayor. Courtney, can you help me understand how not knowing the name of a short-term rental owner is different than not knowing the name of a long-term rental owner? I understand that police and fire come places, they see the tenants, they have a problem, they're trying to get in touch with the owner. But how is that any different between a short-term rental and a long-term rental? And in either case, is the property owner, right?
Madam Mayor, council member, I think the answer is yes and no. In some cases, the short-term rental facilitator is different than the platform holder, then is different than the actual owner of the property. So I think property manager versus property owner versus the platform that rents the short-term rental, but I'll look into it.
Madam Mayor, to follow up, and this is the last for me, I promise. My guidance would be different than the council president's. It sounds like we're conceding that we can't point to a harm here. So really, we're just asking the public to turn over information about their private dealings so that we can ascertain who they are, what they're doing, and what harm that may be. We wouldn't have the authority, for instance, to just send subpoenas to people and ask them how they're using their property. There has to be a harm. We regulate for the general welfare. We regulate to prevent harms or to promote good. But here, creating a regulatory scheme and charging people money so that they can turn over information to us doesn't seem quite right. So my direction would be come back with clear and concrete demonstrable harms that registration will fix. And then that is more appropriate in my mind to be regulating.
Madam Mayor.
Yes, go ahead.
I have one more question, and it relates to taxation on these properties. Has anyone spoken to the tax commission to see what it looks like on their end? Because I know that all of the platforms, all of the widely used platforms collect taxes on each of these properties, and there might be some good information ascertained there as far as if one person is owning multiple properties or if these are a little bit more dispersed in ownership.
Madam Mayor, council member, I'll write that down. I'll follow up on that.
Madam Mayor, I guess similarly, I would like for us to have a little bit more information before we enact any kind of regulation. I don't feel like that question has been answered for me at this point. And I'm not saying that it won't be answered for me, but I think before we enact an ordinance where we require somebody to license something that we're not even sure is causing harm, I would prefer a little bit more information and a really solid definition of short-term rental.
Madam Mayor, if it's decided that we're not ready to do the ordinance, I'm wondering, I know on the list we had community outreach. Maybe we need to start there where we've done listening sessions for other issues. I'm wondering if that's maybe what we need to do. I know for myself, I have folks who've interacted with property managers who have been hired to oversee issues with short-term rentals in the neighborhood. I've had friends reached out to by those property managers. So the neighborhood is being interrupted. My friend said, I don't want to be in charge of reporting somebody who's occupying a space next to me. That's somebody else's job, but it feels like it's my job. As much as she was grateful for the property manager to come over and give her their card in case there were issues. So I do feel there is a disruption happening in our neighborhoods, but maybe we need to do some more outreach and let everybody who feels that they're affected by this phenomenon to give input on how they may be being harmed.
Madam Mayor.
Yeah.
Just so I guess everyone has the ability to say the direction that they would like to see. I would like to see us move forward with this. I think it's a good step in better regulating and better knowing exactly what problems do or do not exist. And the example I would give is if somebody's living in a house and they're renting out their ADU or living somewhere and renting out another property in Boise to supplement their income or to stay in their house, to me, that's not a problem. And an $80 fee in licensing isn't necessarily a burden if we can make sure that it also better informs neighbors, emergency services of what sort of exists. Somebody who might own 10 properties in town that could potentially be available for long-term rentals, to me, is an issue and is a problem. And I think that this gives us some steps to better regulate those. And so I do think it is worth taking some steps to better regulate and seeing if more steps are needed going forward.
All right, well, do you all have the feedback you need to come back with more information?
Yes, Madam Mayor.
Great, thank you. Okay, with that, we have an executive session.
Madam Mayor, I move we go into executive session, personnel, land acquisition, records exempt from public disclosure, pending probable litigation, communicate with risk management regarding pending probable claims, labor contract, Idaho Code 74-206, 1B, C, D, F, I, and J.
Hopefully the whole for that. Will you take the roll?
Bajent,
Yes.
Clegg,
Yes.
Halliburton.
Yes.
Sanchez,
Yes.
Thompson.
Yes.
Woodings.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.